I see people coming in. My name is Patrick Creran. I'm a professor of English here at St. Leo University, and I'd like you to welcome everyone to our reading for tonight. J.A. or Josh Bernstein, who's the 2020 winner of the Wilt Prize for Creative Nonfiction, which is published by Green Rabbit Press. In Lightning Key Review through the help and support also of St. Leo University. So thanks to everyone for coming out tonight for this reading. I'd just like to send special thanks to the Department of Language Studies and the Arts, who helps support us in so many different ways, as well as to the Cannon Memorial Library, who offers their support. This reading is also sponsored by the Sandhill Writers Retreat, and with me tonight is John David Harding, who is helping to organize the Sandhill Writers Retreat, and he just has a special pitch we're gonna do it off the top before we get to introducing Josh.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Josh, for being here. Hey, everybody, I'm John David, and I am the Assistant Director of Sandhills Writers Retreat, and we're really excited this year because we are going to be hosting the Sandhill Writers Retreat virtually, which I think gives everybody a really good opportunity to, more than in previous years, attend as many sessions as they want, because we're going to be recording everything. So you'll be able to go back and go to all of the different workshops that you might have missed in the past. So we offer workshops in poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and this year we're going to have a publishing workshop. So if you're looking to publish your work and you wanted some advice from a seasoned writer, this is going to be a good retreat for you. Some of our faculty are going to include Brian Turner, Helen Pruitt Wallace, who's the Poet Laureate of St. Petersburg, Florida, Sterling Watson, and Susan Lilly, who's the Poet Laureate of Orlando. So if you want to learn more about the retreat, I'm just going to put in the chat our website. I think it's almost ready to start taking registrations. We might not be there just yet, but you can go there and read about the retreat, read some testimonials from the past, and we hope to see you there. Thank you. Thanks, Patrick.
No problem, and thanks again for helping us sponsor this this great opportunity. So I'd like to introduce our special guest, and then we'll just have a brief conversation, and then Josh is going to read from the new essay chapbook here, and then as that's happening, if you all have any questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A chat there, and then after Josh is done reading, we'd be more than happy to answer. Josh will be more than happy to answer any questions that we have for a little Q&A with the audience here. All right, so Josh Bernstein's volumes include a novel, Rachel's Tomb, which won the Association of Writers and Writing Program Awards, otherwise known as AWP Series Prize, a chapbook, Desert Castles, from Southern Indiana Review, which won the Wilhelmus Prize. And he also has a forthcoming story collection called Sticklight that he just told us about. So congratulations there. His stories, poems, and essays have appeared in about 80 journals and anthologies, including Washington Square, Kenyon Review, Boston Review, Cutbank, and Shenandoah. His academic articles have appeared in the Conradian, Conrad in Nature, Conrad in Ethics, in Western American Literature, and won the Harkness Young Conrad Scholar Award. A Chicago native and former Fulbright scholar, he's the Director of Graduate Studies in English and an assistant professor at the University of Southern Mississippi, as well as the fiction editor of Tikkun. More of his work can be found at his website, which is writingwar.com. Please welcome Josh Bernstein to us. So hooray. I know it's so weird, it's a silent reception, but everyone's applauding. I know it, everyone who's here, and thanks so much for joining. So thanks so much, Josh, for joining us today. So I'm just going to ask a few questions, and then we'll get to the main event here. But I find sometimes in Zoom, it's hard just to, start right off with a reading, and it's easier maybe just to have a little bit of a conversation. The new collection, which is here, and I know it's backwards on the camera here, but it's a Northern Cowboy. And Josh has some copies that he can sell, and we can figure out how to make that happen. If you'd like a copy, maybe just write it in the chat, and we can figure out how to get one to you. But it's a collection of nonfiction essays again, that won our contest here, and a lot of these essays have something to do with family. And I thought I'd just start off just talking a little bit about what you think is the hardest and easiest part of writing about family.
That's a great question, and probably the most uncomfortable question any writer could be asked.
Well, I'm glad I asked it first then, right?
Especially when my mother is here and my wife and my 3 kids. So it's
Oh no.
but I'll just say that despite calling this nonfiction, I think every writer has some liberties when it comes to family. But actually, the truth is, I don't think of myself as writing about family very much. I teach a graduate workshop on creative nonfiction at the University of Southern Mississippi, where I have students who submit writing to me, and I'm always amazed at their comfort level in talking about family or talking about really family traumas. And those are things I generally avoid in my own writing, not because maybe because I'm uncomfortable writing them, but for me, I don't know, for whatever reason, those are things that I try to keep private. So when I do involve family, I try to do it in a context that would allow me to speak to my family again, although we'll see if my mother wishes to talk to me again tomorrow. That'll be the test.
That's always hard. Yeah, it is. And I think, if you've ever attempted to write an essay, that's always one of the trickiest parts is how much do you disclose? How much do you sort of, keep so that you can maintain those relationships and stuff. Another writer, a nonfiction writer, who's written a lot about family, for better or for worse, is Tobias Wolfe. And in the opening of his famous memoir, This Boy's Life, he has this quote, and he says that memory has its own story to tell, which I've always loved. And I think whenever you're writing nonfiction and you read such detailed writing, and I think your essays certainly have so many great details that stick out when we're writing them. I think a lot of times writers ask, like, how do you get to the concrete level so well, in your essays? How do you mine memory, for those sorts of details there?
Well, thank you for the compliment. I can only hope through. It's funny you mentioned Tobias Wolfe, because he's been a big influence on my writing. I've never met him, but I remember reading In Pharaoh's Army, and one other's his book. I forget which one it was. It was also really good. A Garden of North American Martyrs.
Oh yeah.
And and his fiction reads like nonfiction. I mean, it's really powerful, and it's because of exactly what you said. I mean, he latches onto these small details, and he can get so much work out of them. But one of the things I do, I think, like a lot of writers, I take notes. I'm constantly taking notes. I must have at least 30 volumes of notebooks stored in my parents' basement in their house in Michigan somewhere. I have at least that many in my house too. And so it's kind of I think, like all writers, we take as many notes as we can. We have observations, and then part of the writing process is just editing, is figuring out what's worthy of incorporation into a story. Although the risk, as I'm sure you know, and as anybody who writes knows, is that you also want to let the writing breathe. And if it becomes too constrained by facts or too constrained by sort of recapturing exact details, it loses its flair. So it's a balance that I think you have to strike.
Yeah. And I think you're definitely striking that balance in this collection here. And again, I think John David said if anyone's interested in purchasing a copy, you can email him there in the chat also, so we can get copies to people. One of the things that I noticed about this collection also is that place plays such a vital role in a lot of these essays. Chicago, but also Mississippi, Michigan, Jerusalem at certain points, and even the old Chicago Stadium, which is now the United Center. So how does place inspire you? How does that come across in your own writing process, would you say?
That's a great question, Patrick. And I think part of the reason my writing deals with so many places is just a reflection of the way writers live today. So many of us, and I think all working professionals, we're constantly mobile. I think that's just the nature of the economy and the way we are. And I'm happy in Mississippi and hope to stay here for the rest of my career. But the reality is I've moved around just because I'm a writer, and that's what writers have to do, especially when they're in their beginning stages. We've now lived in, between my wife and I think we've lived in something like 30 apartments or houses over the course of our lives, maybe more than that. And it's, that's both a good and a bad thing. I mean, it's painful in a way because you lose touch with people you really want to remain friends with. And it's hard to connect with them, but it's also helpful as a writer because you get a sense of so many different environments, and I think that shapes our writing. And then you grow attached to the places that you care about and you write about them. One thing I've never been able to do well is write about a place while I'm living in it. So I find myself writing more and more about places like Chicago or Jerusalem or even Duluth, Minnesota, where I lived formerly. But I could never do that at the time when I was there. So.
Why do you think that is? Do you think you were just too close to the place as you were living there, or?
Yeah. Maybe it's a good question. I don't know. I think to get a good perspective on anything, you need distance. I mean, I don't.
Sure.
We're increasingly living in a world where writers, especially if they're writing nonfiction, are required to put out books right away or sort of meet an urgency, especially if they're doing work that's going to sell well. But I think the problem that poses for writing is that we need time. Good work takes a long time to process and reflect on and grow. And one of the essays in this collection that I'm going to read from, I think tonight, is Of Musk and Beer, which I actually wrote, I think 7 or 8 years ago, and I've returned to it and I revised it for the collection. But it's but in some ways, I think even that is about an incident that occurred 15 or 20 years prior. So it's just a question, I think, of giving yourself the distance you need to remember the place and let it grow in your imagination too.
Yeah. And you're a writer who kind of came from the North and now you've settled in Mississippi there. I had a similar journey, and I know a lot of people who have done that. How do you see the South in particular as sort of a geography, a culture that is as someone coming from kind of the northern area, does that make it easier? Does it make it harder to kind of write about the South, would you say?
Yeah. I hope everybody can hear me. My microphone is not great. And I don't want to have people have to look at my nostrils while I read, but I might have to hear me. So
it's good. I think it's gotten louder, so that's good. Yeah.
I will say that of all the places I've lived, the South is far and away the most foreign to me and also the most interesting to me. It's a world that I don't understand, and every day I'm here, I realize there's less and less of it that I understand. I mean, I love it, but it's also, sometimes it drives me crazy, and sometimes it's exactly where I want to be. So it's a complicated thing. Hattiesburg is also not the prototypical South. The town I live in is pretty progressive, and it's sort of a bastion of what you might call liberalism is the word, but we have a vibrant queer community, and I think people of color can live pretty comfortably, I hope, peacefully with what we call white people. But it's and I don't know if it's an anomaly in that regard. I don't want to overstate it because it has a lot of problems too and a lot of disparities. But it's not the reputation that people. It doesn't have the reputation I think people associate with other parts of the South. But I will say that I think the South appreciates literature in a way that nowhere else I live really has. I mean, most of the work that I've published has actually come out of the South. One of my earliest stories was in Shenandoah. Others were in an Alabama Literary Review and some others. Tampa Review was an early champion of my work, and maybe it's just because I write about the military so much and that resonates down here. But I also I really believe that the South promotes literature in a way that I wish the rest of the country did. I find I have more bookstores here in Hattiesburg than I did in Chicago, as far as I know.
Yeah.
And it's a community that really does care about books. I mean, for all the problems that one might associate with the South, I think there's a real respect for writers and writing down here that I wish existed everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, and I think there's a great appreciation also for kind of even within regions. I have a few friends who write they consider themselves North Carolina writers, as opposed to, a writer of the South or something like that. And, within the South, there's even sort of distinctions, and which is maybe not necessarily the truth. I'm from Ohio originally, so that's a little hard. There's not really like an Ohio writers coalition or anything like that. So just talking a little bit about writing, just in general, you mentioned, some of the literary journals that you had subscribed to and or had published in early champions and work. You're a fiction editor yourself, and I was wondering, like, what are you looking for in a story when you're editing? Maybe that's a little bit different than when you're writing a story or something like that, or how those two play out for you. So what are you looking for in a story, and maybe how that differs from what appears on a page sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the classic answer to that is a good beginning. So I mean, I do think, when I read for Tikkun magazine, we get, a fair amount of submissions, and the reality is to really get captured by work, I have to get pretty engrossed in the first, couple pages or so. And so I think, and I wish that weren't the case, but like most editors, I'm just overburdened and I don't have time to sort of give each story the attention it deserves. I wish I did. So the reality is, I think pieces need to start strong. And I tell my students the same thing when they produce work, if they're submitting to journals, or if they have a book they're showing to an agent or sending out to a contest. I tell them that the beginning matters. But again, that's largely a product of consumer culture, and I don't think a book should have to start strong. Some of the books my favorite book is actually, one of my favorite books is actually Nostromo. So I have a copy of her somewhere around here. And I think the first 200 pages of it are pretty slow and boring. I gotta say, that's a Joseph Conrad book, but once it takes off, my God, I mean, what Conrad can do with words, and showing the depravity of the human soul. I mean, it's just, he's like Michael Jordan for me when he's on. There's no comparison there.
I love it. I love it. Conrad as Jordan would be an interesting suiting up for the Bulls. That'd be interesting. Speaking of writers and ball players who are considered kind of triple threats, you yourself write in multiple genres, and you've published a novel. You have the collection of short stories come out. We have the collection here of nonfiction. I know you've published poetry as well. How do you decide when an idea comes to you, what will be what in terms of genre?
That's a great question. And it's funny you asked that, because I asked the same question to Andrew Monson last week.
Oh, yeah.
He was visiting my class, and he didn't have a very good answer, to be honest. He's one of my favorite writers. I don't know. I'm a firm believer that the words themselves should dictate the form that a piece takes, whether that's the genre or the length or the, everything, from the title to the characterization. I believe that the best works come about naturally, to the extent that can happen, rather than being superimposed by the author. And so I think if a story needs to take the form of a story, I let it. If sometimes the words come out in the form of poetry, I let it. I often start with a line. If a phrase or a line will come into my head while I'm jogging or while I'm sleeping. Sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and have a phrase that I need to write down. My wife thinks I'm insane for doing that, but I think every writer does that. And so, and then I think it's just it's a question of letting the work sort of sculpt itself. You don't want to sort of tell it what to do. Yeah.
And when you're kind of working on the single project, do you have a larger project in mind, or are you just sort of focused on the singularity of the thing in front of you? Let's see. I think I think we'll stop there just with this conversation, even though I've really enjoyed these answers and stuff. But I think we can definitely take more questions after the reading. But I don't want to delay that anymore. And I'd love to hear you read your piece here. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you so that we can all hear and enjoy one of your essays. So.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I appreciate that. It really means a lot to me to have you here, and everybody else who's here. John David Harding, Jesse Van Erden, Gianna Russo, Penny Freeman, I'm just thanking other people who put this together, the staff and readers at Green Rabbit Press and the Sandhill Writers Retreat that you mentioned, Patrick. I know how much work it is to put into a book and to make it come together, and you guys have been tireless in that effort, and I really appreciate your dedication there. And thank you, Jesse, also for selecting the book. And thank you to my colleagues. I think Angela Ball is here, and others at the Center for Writers and the School of Humanities at USM. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my wife, Dina, and my kids, Sarah, Naomi, and Abram, who are at home right now. And I hope watching My Little Pony instead of watching me, so they don't have to hear my reading. And my sister and her family, Jenny Bernstein and Jim Lindstrom and their kids, and my parents, Gina and Nancy Bernstein. And also to my friends and from all over the world who are here. It really does mean a lot to me to have everybody here. And I'm sorry I can't see everybody's faces, but you can type your questions in the chat, or as long as they're G-rated, and I'll do my best to answer them. All right. Or even if they're not, that's fine too. All right, I'm gonna read a selection of an essay called "Of Musk and Beer," which is about the Chicago Bulls. The loudest thing I have ever heard in my life, apart from an RPG explosion when I was serving in the Israeli army, was the roar of Chicago Stadium. This was the old building, a veritable dungeon of peeling brick and red concrete. Built in 1929 as the world's largest arena, the place actually smelled like the Depression, to the extent an era has a smell. Over-roasted salt peanuts, stale sodden carpets, cigar smoke, and watered down beer, along with the sleet-crusted shoes and sweat of its patrons, 20,000 of whom filed through its doors each night. The actual capacity, 18,676, including standing room only, is a number that any tried and true Bulls fan knows, because Frito-Lay, in the early 90s, would pipe it across the Bulb scoreboard as part of its promotional quiz. Even my father, who never paid attention to, quote, crap of that sort, he was usually busy yelling at the coach, mumbled the right answer, as if he were incanting a prayer. This was while munching on nachos and alternately shouting, "Phil's got his head up his ass." In retrospect, Phil probably didn't, considering that the Bulls of that era won 6 championships, set the single season record for wins, and boasted what was probably the most phenomenal athlete, if not team, in the history of recorded sports. What I remember most is how difficult it was to breathe in those seats, not that anyone cared. Cigarette smoke was rampant, but that was far less noxious to the senses than the perpetual odor of sweat. It seemed like everyone sweated, even the immaculate banker, for example, who, along with his wife, sat stiffly in the seats to our left. Both were African-American, 40-ish, and impeccably dressed. He in a vested suit and trim mustache, like a wire on his silent lips. She in a gaudy white coat of what must have been mink, pearls, and delicate scarves. Neither one spoke during the games, apart from the occasional pleasantries. Even more remarkable, in a city of 1 million African-Americans, they were the only ones in our tier, which says as much about Chicago, and possibly sports generally, as it does my own segregated upbringing. Regardless, I was enthralled by the place, the endless pandemonium, the hollers, the stink, the occasional fights in the seats, yet most of all was the noise, like a constant ring in my ears. Former players on visiting teams regularly attest that Chicago Stadium was the loudest arena in sports. Conservatively, I'd estimate that the decibel level peaked at 135. According to ESPN, it was once measured 130, which is equivalent to a jet taking off at O'Hare, but that was recorded during a Hawks game. Anyone who witnessed a Bulls pregame introduction, a howling spectacle of spotlights and smoke, punctuated by the undulating voice of Ray Clay, can attest that the effect was ear-shattering, not that anyone cared. By the time a certain guard at 6'6" from North Carolina was announced, so many bulbs were flashing, so many voices were thundering, that the actual appearance of the man was, in fact, disappointing. Then the lights came back on. Everybody's hands were chafed, their voices reedy, their breath nearly dissipated, lost. The only relief was Phil Jackson, walking up the sidelines, clipboard and pencil in hand. He really was the conductor. It's said that some opera houses were designed, either explicitly or otherwise, with particular composers in mind. Bayreuth, Wagner, La Fenice, Verdi, the Vienna State Opera House, Mozart. In 1994, when the new Chicago Stadium, i.e. the United Center, was erected, fans who attended couldn't help but noticing their malaise. Everything about it was bigger and newer and shinier. It remains the largest indoor stadium in the US. Yet Superman had retired. He'd be back in 95, and more than a few began to reminisce about the congestion and noise of the stadium. In 96, shortly after it was demolished and converted into, what else, a parking lot, my father, who shared season tickets, was mailed a slab of wood. Purported to be from the old floorboards, it was heavily glossed and painted as the stadium's court, replete with red hash marks and a snorting center court bowl. To say it offended my sensibilities as a fan would be like saying that Woodstock attendees were less than enthused with Pepsi's 1994 remake. Do we have more time, or should I pause there? How are we doing here?
I think you can keep going. Yeah,
right.
You're good.
It's not much longer.
Yeah.
Of the memories I have from that stadium, none is more vivid than this. It was the winter of '90 and unseasonably cold that year, even for Chicago. Just before 5 p.m. one evening, when the sun had dipped down and the projects shone eerily dark, my father and I emerged from the parking lot and arrived at the stadium's locked front doors. About 100 had gathered already and pressed against the glass. No game was scheduled for tonight, but as a promotion for season ticket holders, an autograph session with the players was going to be held. I had attended the event once before and remember being thrilled with an autograph of Jack Haley. My little sister, who was 8 and madly in love with a point guard named B.J. Armstrong, found that extremely disappointing. Of course, I had tried to find Pippen or Horace or even the big man himself, but the lines had stretched around the corner and were cut off before I arrived. This time, my father and I arrived 2 hours early, intending to stake out a place. We were located to an entrance on Madison, where I managed to squeeze my way to the front. It was impossible to know which door would be open first or which players would be stationed where. All we knew is that 15 players would be waiting at 15 gates. An icy wind bit my face, but I was filled with the anticipation that only a 12-year-old knows. I could have frozen to death then and frankly not cared. That year, the Bulls were still an underdog. They'd lose to the Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals, as they had the year before. Despite that, their leader was probably the most photographed man on the planet, more so than Gorbachev, John Paul II, even that other MJ, whose dance moves I had learned well. To any 12-year-old growing up in Chicago, hell, on planet Earth, the prospect of meeting him was simply too much to bear. I figured I'd try to find Pippen. When the doors opened at 7:05, magically it seemed, I remember being swept in by the rush of the crowd and separated from my father. His apparition, parted through the crowds, yelled to me, "Go." This was in a time before cell phones. What he was thinking wasn't clear. Either way, I raced down the halls of the stadium, notebook in hand, trailed by my mittens and scarf. Others stopped at various gates. Craig Hodges, Ed Neely, the venerable Stacey King, all noted by printed signs. Soon I found myself all alone, wondering if I was lost or had somehow exited the stadium. All the vendors were closed. The walls were black brick, familiar vaguely in the rotting beer scent. All the gates to the floors were closed. Then ahead of me, I noticed what can only be described as a heavenly light. Think of the pearly gates in St. Peter. About 24 autograph seekers, professionals it seemed, judging by the tracksuits they wore, jostled closely beside the round wall. Others kept falling in line. I knew that this was the place. I couldn't wait to meet Pippen. About 5 minutes later, my father somehow caught up to me. By that point, the line was closed off, and those of us who had made it huddled next to the wall. For whatever reason, it was freezing inside the hall. Perhaps they hadn't turned on the heat, which would certainly underscore the then owner's reputation. My father scratched at his beard. He eyed the long line. "How did you get here?" "I don't know," I said, winded. "You know who you're waiting to see?" I didn't, in fact. "Horace Grant?" My father laughed a bit, gruffly. "You better get out a pen." In Moby Dick, that other great saga of madness and youthful ambition, the white whale is only first seen 133 chapters in. By that point, we've had every conceivable description of him, from how he tastes to how he smells. In fact, the first sighting is described aromatically. That night, I'm doing my best Melville here, that night in the mid-watch, when the old man, as is his wont at intervals, stepped forth from the scuttle in which he leaned and went to his pivot hole, he suddenly thrust out his face fiercely, snuffing up the sea air as a sagacious ship's dog will, and drawing nigh to some barbarous isle. He declared that a whale must be near. Like Ahab, I sensed a faint musk in the air and knew that greatness was near. As the curtains which partition the aisle slowly drew back from time to time, I caught a glimpse of a figure seated in a chair surrounded by dozens more. But most perceptible was his scent, some odored cologne combined with the stink of the halls. It might have been aftershave or even talc, but it's a smell I'll always recall. As the curtains finally opened before me and screaming parties descended the stairs, all in ecstasy over the man they'd encountered, I caught a glimpse of him. My first glimpse, in fact, from up close. He looked more human than on screen, though strangely surreal in that outfit. The white nylon shorts, the black spandex, the jersey bearing 23. His eyes were flitting constantly, first to a reporter, then to a camera, then to several more at his side. He was signing autographs like a machine, arms outstretched, taking orders and delivering goods. An instant wave of shock ran across me. I was standing next to the man. When the guards escorted me up to his level, which was inside the arena, I handed him my notepad and pen. He sighed and signed his name, less in haste than discomfort. Our eyes never actually met. I didn't care, though. I was standing next to the man. This is an experience that cannot be articulated verbally, much less for a boy of 12. Or for a man of 42, as I suppose I am. For at least 6 years, or as far back as I could dribble a ball, I had modeled my game after his, like everyone else I knew. By age 12, it was apparent that I wouldn't be pursuing his path. And yet, I still nurtured the dream. The floater over Elo, the crossover and fade against Bird, the endless flying dunk from the free throw line that had been photographed innumerable times. Most of all, that smile he didn't cast. I wasn't disappointed. I backed away from the gate, still accompanied by my father, who was holding my hand as we walked. Suddenly, we were accosted by cameras. An anchorwoman introduced herself. She shoved an enormous foam microphone in my face, and a blinding light hovered. "How does it feel to have the autograph of the greatest basketball player on the planet?" she asked. I blinked, then looked at the camera. "It's awesome," I said with a smile. That evening, we watched the clip on the news. My mother was thrilled, my father still speechless, and my sister disappointed that I still hadn't met the right man. Thank you. And I also just want to say that piece was written with the thought of Chip Smoller in mind, who's not with us here tonight physically, but in memory.
That's great. I love it. It reminded me a lot of over the quarantine. I watched The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan documentary, and when I read your collection prior to it, and then I was reading it, and I was like, yes, this is it, right? This is sort of the nostalgia of growing up in that era, because we're about the same age. So yeah. Did you watch that documentary?
You know, it's funny. A lot of people have asked me that, and I can't bring myself to watch it because it would be too. And I know my father feels the same way. I can't put my finger on exactly why, but it's something about it. It like that era is so special to me that it would almost be tainted to watch it through, a photographer's eyes. I will eventually, but I've heard it was simply amazing. So I should watch it. I really do want to watch it. At the same time, it's just. Once you've met Michael Jordan in person, what's a documentary going to tell you?
It is true, yeah. And it's such a challenge when I think you do. It's so great, and that was one of the things I loved about the essay was, in reading it. I mean, he's this super famous person, right? And so, if you were, I don't know, a kid in the barbershop in the, late 80s, early 90s, and you grabbed the Sports Illustrated, columns and columns and columns are devoted to this figure. And I think, you still manage to capture something new and exciting, and make us feel excited about through your eyes and perspective. And I think that's such a hard thing to do, right? To kind of defamiliarize a figure like that who is so familiar to us in some way. So yeah, I thought that was great.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah. It looks like we have one question from Delita. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. And it says, so whose autograph did you get?
This is Michael Jordan, Delita. But I forgive Delita for not knowing that. She's Swedish and Israeli, and maybe she does know.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, it's there. Yeah, so we have time for any questions that you'd like to ask Josh. He'll be kind enough to answer them for him. You can type them into the Q&A box. I think it's maybe down on the bottom panel of the Zoom. If you have any questions there for him, he'd be happy. Oh yeah, Delita said the reality presented by the documentary would ruin the aura and nostalgia of the era, which I think is, yeah, I think that's true. Do you have any predictions? Are you following college basketball at all? The big tournament is about to start tomorrow. Do you have any predictions for? Did you make a bracket?
I did make a bracket, yeah, and
okay.
And I asked my wife if I could fill out her bracket for her, and I think that's to say that's not going to happen. Yeah. I admit that all my family is rooting for Illinois.
Okay. Yeah,
they're devoted Illinois fans, so of course I picked Gonzaga.
A contrarian by heart, right?
I'm rooting for Illinois too, I admit.
Okay, yeah. I went to Ohio State, so I'm not so keen on Illinois after their treatment of us multiple times this season. They've done really well, so but I'd like to see a Big Ten team win it. So it'd be, Illinois or Michigan seem like the two that could. So
well, if you're at Ohio State, at least you have a football team to root for. Let's say it's been a long time in Illinois since we've had even a professional team that was competitive. So
this is true. This is true. I think we have a couple of questions here. It looks like Miriam Shapira asked, does your writing process change depending on the genre?
That's a great question. And thank you, Miriam and Delita, for being here, and all my other friends too. Yeah, I think for me, nonfiction comes a little bit more natural, a little bit easier. And that's more first draft oriented. I wouldn't say first draft because everything I publish or ultimately publish goes through countless drafts, but somehow the finished product comes about more quickly for me in nonfiction. Fiction takes a long time and a lot of pain for me to produce, at least for me to do something well. I don't know, maybe other writers don't feel that way. I mean, I do know Joseph Conrad suffered a mental breakdown while writing and would, famously swear at himself in Polish, and his wife thought he was insane. And he was probably a manic depressive too. In fact, I think he did try to kill himself when he was 38 by shooting himself in the chest. So that's not a good thing to get into here. But I do think that for fiction for me is absolutely purgative. That's the word. I mean, it's the most beautiful thing when it works. And to me, it's such a gorgeous thing to produce a piece of fiction that you're proud of. But it's so hard, and it requires so much revision and so much suffering. I think I wish it didn't feel that way, and I know other writers don't feel that way. But for me, to produce the work that I ultimately care about, I really do have to go through a lot. And I don't know, maybe that'll change. I'm hoping it'll change. I'm hoping my next novel will be a little more smooth sailing for me. But I definitely
I think
I should nonfiction. Yeah, Patrick.
Yeah, I was just saying that it seems like the nonfiction aspect, you have something that you're working with. There's a reality of some sort, maybe not the same one that everyone sees, but it does seem like that gives you a little bit of a boost as opposed to fiction that can just be anything. So, which is harsh. Let's see, we got a couple more. just a couple comments. So Josh can't divulge his picks. There are too many of his fellow pool mates listening. That was from PMG there. No question, just a comment from Samuel Lahaski. The Hawks with Dominique definitely warranted 130 decibels plus or whatever there. And then a couple of questions. Paige McBride asks, can you explain the ending? And wasn't it Michael Jordan that said, eat your Wheaties in the 1990s? So maybe you can take those separately if you want to talk about the ending. And then if that was 90s era Jordan.
Just that my sister was obsessed with a basketball player named B.J. Armstrong.
Right.
She was disappointed that I hadn't met B.J. Armstrong. And I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of B.J. Armstrong in the 90s, but he actually looked like he was 8 years old when he was playing for the Bulls. So she just thought he was the most adorable. And he was, I mean, I can say, if I could say I have a man crush on B.J. Armstrong, he was adorable looking. I think he still is. I haven't seen him recently though.
He's a pretty handsome guy, yeah. And then Karen Feldberg asks, what or who inspired you to become a writer?
Well, I can say her father, Ben Robbins, is my grandfather. He, for many years, he used to write screenplays and scripts and send them off to Hollywood. I don't know if he was ever successful, but we, as my Karen knows, we discovered those, I think, after he passed away. And I was always sort of inspired by that, just knowing that and I remember him telling jokes at the dinner table, just regaling, the family with jokes. He had a stroke, so I think his health deteriorated after that when I was young. But him and my other grandfather too, for whom my son is named, Abram, were just very oratory people. They just love to tell stories, and I try to do that with my kids at night. I try to make up stories for them when we go to bed. I should be doing that every night. I don't always, but sometimes it's the best exercise for a writer is just to make up a story for 5 or 10 minutes when you're telling, when you're trying to get your kids to go to bed at night. It gets you in the habit of telling stories. And I think my oldest daughter, Sarah, is actually better at that storytelling, maybe Naomi and Abram, than I am. So we'll see.
That's great. Yeah, what a story too about you said it was your grandfather who had written these screenplays and sent them off to Hollywood. Yeah, wow, that's fantastic. We have another question here from Xavier Carroll, who's a student of mine. Thanks, Xavier, for coming out tonight. He says the advice is often given to writers to write what they know. What do you think, or do you think there's a danger to writing about things too close to you?
I mean, apart from family?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, Xavier. And I'm actually teaching a workshop next semester with my students where the goal is to write what you don't know. And that's like the specific focus of the class, is to try to move beyond that which is real or personal to you. And I think that's important. That's not to say that you want to sort of appropriate other people's experiences, but you do want to sort of feel comfortable moving outside your own comfort zone and writing about that which is new. I mean, I think the best fiction ultimately comes from the imagination and from the heart, not from the notebooks. And so it's important to sort of let yourself breathe on the page and try for things that you wouldn't normally write. I don't write as much what we call speculative fiction. I don't write as much fantasy. I mean, I do like reading it. Sometimes, I think some of the best science fiction is right up there with Conrad. But even within the realm of what we call literary fiction, or that's not a good word because speculative is often literary, but even with the realm of what we call realistic fiction, I think you can definitely step outside yourself and move away from your own experiences and write about realms that are completely unfamiliar to you. I mean, Conrad himself had never really been to Latin America. I think he might have set foot off, in Central America a couple times when he was, stepping over off a boat when he was working for the Imperial Marines there. But he wasn't. That he invented an entire world in Nostromo, largely on the basis of reports and descriptions and research. And to me, it comes alive more than any of his books that are set in London, where he lived for all his adult life. So, go figure.
Yeah, really, that's fantastic. Carolyn Moon, who's a professor here at the library, the Cameron Memorial Library. She works with archives and was a good friend to the man who the prize is named after here. And I saw his wife Denise is here as well, Kurt Wilt, who the prize is named after. So thanks, special thanks for both of you for coming out. Carol Ann asks, has the pandemic year changed your writing in some way?
You know, that's a great question too. And I think like a lot of writers, I'm becoming increasingly nostalgic. You know, I'm thinking about, you know, just being in a crowded bar or a crowded restaurant or the things that we used to take for granted. Um,
Yeah.
and how much, you know, we can make of those experiences. I mean, yeah, and I'll be honest too. A lot of my writing is turning towards nostalgia now. I mean, I'm writing a lot about the '90s and the '80s, to the extent I can remember them. Just because I don't know, for some reason the last year is literally a blur to me, like it is to everybody else. So
Yeah. Yeah. The other day I looked on my phone. Every Christmas I usually make a calendar for my parents to just fill it with pictures, and I only had like, I think I had 7 pictures on my phone for the whole year. That's all I had done, and I was like, yeah, I can't make a calendar out of that. It's terrible. It's terrible. Okay. Christopher Barkin asks, can you explain the beginning of the essay now? Would you say that memories gain their vividness in moments when we are most vulnerable? I ask because at the beginning of the story, you contextualize this memory in a comparison to the terrifying sound of an incendiary device or something like that, or the memory of that sound of the incendiary device is too terrifying to write about, except that literary language gives a writer the means to do so through metaphors, etc. That's the end. Yeah.
that's a great question too, and I would only expect that from Chris Barkin, who's actually a philosopher and believe it or not has a book coming out, if I can say that, on
Oh, yeah, please.
Foucault and Marx. Chris, my answer to that is that I'm sure you're familiar with, I'm going to get heavy here, Kant's notion of the sublime, where he thinks that that which is really aesthetic is also combined with an element of terror, that which is frightening. And for him, you know, it's even work that is somehow beyond the beautiful, or what he calls the transcendent, also incorporates an element of fear or apprehension. And my sense is that's, for me, maybe if I associate a military explosion with you know, being lost in Chicago Stadium as a child, it's because it's such a wonderful experience, but also because it's frightening, you know. And I think there's an overlap between that which is really beyond beautiful, that which is so moving to us, and also that which is kind of terrifying. I don't know if that makes sense, but and Patrick, I'm glad to see your family is there too. So
I know something happened outside. Now they're all crazy. Sorry about that.
not at all. It's my kids would be waving to them too. So. Yeah, Chris, I don't know if that answered your question. I could wax philosophical forever, but no one really wants to hear that. So
yeah, sorry about that. MS1, the comment there says, what did you edit out of this book and why?
If MS1 refers to my friend Michelle Steingart, then I will say it's all my sagas with Michelle and all the experience, all the embarrassing things she's done in her life. Yeah, I wish I could give a good answer to that. I did have another essay that I wanted to include in here that I ultimately ended up not putting in this collection, and I won't go into it here, but and actually I have 2 more essays on the Chicago Bulls, believe it or not. One of which I thought about including in here but didn't. Yeah, and Michelle, it is a good question, and I've thought hard about that. I think to make a book work, you have to be really selective. You know, you have to be really careful about what goes into the final version. I had another essay that's all about Michael Jordan's shot over Craig Elo. It's actually one of my favorite pieces. And it goes on for, you know, I think 10 or 15 pages, just describing like the drama behind what's called the shot. And I could devote an entire week to talking about that shot, because I think to me, it's the greatest moment in the history of sports. But it just didn't fit with the collection. It wasn't, you know, I can't say why exactly, but it just didn't work in the context of this book. So.
Did you set out to write like a collection of like Chicago Bulls essays or anything like that?
Yeah, I did, and I still, you know, it's funny because I think a lot of the best writing that I read is actually, believe it or not, sports journalism. I mean, sometimes
Sure.
I think some of the best writing being done, you know, is by sports journalists. Let's see, there's a guy named Zach Lowe who writes I think he used to write for Grantland, now he writes for ESPN. And I read his essays, you know, they're supposed to be reportage, but they're more like essays, you know, they're beautiful.
Yeah.
And then there are a lot of other writers. I grew up reading like Sam Smith's biography of Michael Jordan, which was, I wouldn't call it great literature, but it was engrossing.
It's good, yeah. I mean, I think about like Roger Angel, like, you know, writing for the New Yorker all those years about baseball.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. And
Hunter S.
there's a
Thompson.
website called, oh, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah. There's a website I look at now called The Defector, and a lot of the guys came from Deadspin after sort of Deadspin got bought out, and they wouldn't allow them to write about politics. They told them to stick to sports. But David Roth is just one of these writers who's like, everything he writes is amazing. And you know, sports are sort of always in the background of some larger issue that he's sort of pulling out. It's just fantastic. That's there. Couple more questions here. We say Emily Miller, who's another student of mine. Thanks so much, Emily, for coming out. She just asked, what sci-fi do you read, or what else do you read? Which authors do you draw inspiration from?
Well, Stanislaw Lem is really the one I think Solaris.
Yeah.
Recently. So there's a guy named J. Robert Lennon who I really like. I would, if I call him sci-fi, he's more it's like literary fantasy is probably the best way of putting it. Pieces for the Left Hand, and there's a book I have somewhere around here. I should find it. And then, you know, my wife's been telling me about all these sort of Soviet sci-fi novelists who are unknown, or I think they're big in the Soviet Union, or they were big in the Soviet Union, and nobody knows them nowadays except for, you know, former Soviet citizens. And my next project is to start reading them. I think most of them are untranslated, so I would like to learn more about them.
Yeah. It seems like a whole genre of literature, or, you know, geography of literature just unto itself. You know, just the stuff that doesn't get translated if you know, you don't read in another language, it's massive. Let me see. Oh, Christopher Barkin says it was a good answer, Josh. Thanks. Catherine Duncan, who's a professor of English, a good colleague of mine here in the department, she asks, when writing nostalgically about the past, how do you handle dialogue? Is that the creative part of creative nonfiction, approximations of what was said?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I admit that I take some liberties with dialogue. I mean, I try to reinvent it faithfully. Sometimes I have notes that I work off of. I mean, for example, I just actually was just fortunate to publish an essay in Cutbank earlier this year, and that actually does involve dialogue that actually happened. I took very detailed notes when I was in the military. At that point, I think it was in the reserves, and I just, you know, it was a sort of a charged moment in the conflict there and in my own life. And so I just tried to write down these lines as they came, not knowing where they would work or how they would fit into a story. And I thought they would go into, you know, fiction at some point, but they ended up finding a home in an essay that I think, you know, sat well for them. But sometimes I, you know, I admit that I invent dialogue based on what I think would have been said in the moment. And I think that's a tradition in creative nonfiction that I even try to tell my students, you know, it's okay to sort of faithfully reinvent dialogue as long as it's true to the situation in the moment. You know, you don't want to willfully distort facts, or, you know, you certainly don't want to like put words in people's mouths when that isn't warranted or true. But sometimes you have to sort of recreate dialogue. You know, and just this week I was teaching David Foster Wallace. He has a great collection called Consider the Lobster, and he has a couple essays in there. One of them is called Shipping Out, about a trip on a cruise ship, and another is about a trip to the Illinois State Fair. And after he died, I think was it 2008 or so, Jonathan Franzen made the allegation that Wallace had sort of fabricated a fair amount of the events or incidents, and he completely invented a character called Native Companion in one of his essays. I don't know. I think the jury's still out on whether he did that or not. It might have been the poet Mary Coward he was seeing at the time. It might have been someone. It might have been he completely made up. It didn't matter. I mean, to me, those are still wonderful pieces. And I mean, I know Wallace himself is controversial for other reasons. I mean, I think he was in a pretty abusive relationship with Mary Coward, but regardless, I mean, those are still, you know, they're works of art, you know, and I think he took liberties there in terms of recreating the scene, but he did it in a way that I think is honest, even if it's not what we would call factual.
Yeah, that a trip to the Illinois State Fair, he's waiting in the line, like overhearing like all the conversations that are happening. I mean, yeah, I think about that essay a lot sometimes. And especially when I think about it in context sometimes when Zoom gives you a readout of what you've actually said in class, and sometimes I read it back and I'm like, I have no idea I said that. And if I had to recreate it, I'd be like, I would never say it that way. At least I think I wouldn't say it that way, and I end up doing exactly that. So we have, it looks like one last question here, and this might be a good one to end on because we're sort of coming to the end of it. It's from Cubs fan 1. So, there you go. I saw your Cubs mug in the background there. All right, is it a piggy bank? Yeah, okay. Born to be, there you go. So the Cubs fan 1 asks, what are you working on now? What's next? And seriously, why haven't you watched The Last Dance?
I have a feeling that's got to be Rahul Agrawal, Sam Osterman, and Kim. Yeah, I don't know. I'm working on a bunch of things right now. Truthfully, I'm expanding an essay collection that I'm working with an editor at Galileo Press. I'm turning that into a full-length book, which he's sort of expressed interest in it, and I'm revisiting it now and trying to figure out ways of breathing life into that so it can become a larger project. That's actually, it's derived from the essay I just mentioned in Cut Bank. And I don't know yet whether I want that to be closer to memoir poetry or something in between. I'm hoping it can be sort of an experimental project. And then other things, yeah, I'm just trying to stay afloat right now. Like all of us, I think. I'm just looking forward to watching some basketball this weekend and trying to read to my kids and hopefully have some alone time with my wife and just try to enjoy life while I can. I mean, I think we're all quietly suffering right now with the pandemic coming to an end, and it's we try to find small moments of happiness where we can. And so it means a lot to me to read here tonight and to hear these questions and to have everybody here. I don't mean to get sentimental, but I think we try to find joy where we can, and it's a hard time. For me, this is it.
Well, I think you certainly brought a whole lot of joy to everyone who joined us tonight, and we'll put the recording up for other people to to watch there as well. Once again, if you're interested in purchasing a chapbook of Northern Cowboy, I know it's backwards, but you can reach out to either Josh himself or John David Harding, and we can hook you up and make that happen in terms of purchasing it. But once again, our sincerest thanks to Josh Bernstein for reading us tonight, for all of his answers, and for his generosity and his great talent here that's been on display. It's such a pleasure to have you. Thank you to everyone for coming. We really appreciate it, and we wish everyone health and happiness. So,
thank you, guys.
Thanks so much.
Go, Alana.